So we're going to pick up where we left off last week in John chapter 19, verses 1 through 7. Before we do that, I just want to recap where we have been in this series, the arrest, trial, and execution of Jesus. If you remember, it was just a few weeks ago that we were talking about the illegal arrest of Jesus. They came out against him as if he was an armed insurrectionist and brought approximately 200 soldiers out, surrounded him, and then illegally placed him under arrest based on a baseless warrant in John chapter 11. From there, we saw him before Annas, the high priest, and really what was an illegal interrogation. In the Jewish law, you weren't allowed to interrogate until the witnesses had been confirmed and had provided reliable testimony. Moving from there, we saw the arraignment before Pilate, where Jesus is brought before him. And in John's gospel, there's really only one charge made. That is, it's implied based on Pilate's question that Jesus claimed to be the King of the Jews. But we find the 4 indictments in Luke's gospel. We'll reference those tonight as we move into our sermon. But as we saw last week, Pilate was questioning Jesus, and the question really was, are you the king of a band of zealots? Are you an insurrectionist leading somewhat of a terroristic group? And I know that word terrorist, or Jesus being associated with terrorism, is really strong and maybe even shocks us. But we need to recognize that that's what zealots were considered by Rome in the first century. And so those terms can be used interchangeably as we talk about zealots. And the question was Jesus a zealot? Was he leading a band of zealots? And we see that he wasn't. In fact, Pilate wants to make that clear over and over that Jesus is not leading an insurrection. But today we come to the text where Pilate flogs Jesus. Now, this seems abrupt and sudden in John's gospel. And so, as I've mentioned before, when we lay out the 4 historical gospels side by side, we can get a view of the events that unfolded. But if we want to understand John's theology, we need to read it straight through. Now, imagine this, if you will, for just a moment. Imagine a modern-day situation where you've been indicted. You were arraigned. All the charges were presented. Then you were examined. After the examination, the judge declares that you are not guilty. Now, we've seen those shows before, the movies or court TV. I don't know if you're a court TV junkie. Probably during this season, we're binge watching a lot of things. And so if you've watched court TV or anything like it, you've seen those moments that it's tense, right? It's tense in the courtroom. Now, not every criminal trial is decided by a jury. There's also bench trials where the judge provides the ruling, because you can waive your right to a jury trial. And so we've seen those moments. The defendant seating at the table is asked to stand. It's tense. And then you hear, not guilty. Sometimes they're overcome with emotion. We see that you can see sometimes there's a sense of relief. Other times you see kind of a sense of shock. So imagine you're that person. You've just been declared by the judge not guilty. But then the judge decides that you're going to be taken out back and beaten within an inch of your life to appease the prosecutor. And at that moment, you're like, this is unjust. This is an unjust system, and that's an unjust outcome. You just declared me not guilty, but yet you're going to punish me as if I was. Then you're brought back in after that punishment, and you're declared not guilty again. Prosecution doesn't like it. They ask for the death penalty. The judge then declares you not guilty a 3rd time. And then the prosecution says, well, we want to come up with some new charges. Now, even the thought of that, there's no way in your mind that's realistic. There's no way that could happen. We have checks and balances. We believe we have a fair system. Once I'm found not guilty, that's it. You cannot bring me back and retry me. That would be double jeopardy. You can't punish me if I'm found not guilty. But that's exactly what we see happening in the trial of Jesus. We come to that place when not guilty is not enough. At least it's not enough for the Sanhedrin. It's not enough for the high priest. It's not enough for the Jewish leadership. Jesus being declared guilty was simply not enough for them. Now, when we think about what's omitted here, I want to point out something that Pilate really has a flawed strategy. And what we don't see, we find in the Synoptics, is that he sends him to Herod before this happens, because he recognizes Jesus as a Galilean. And so there's a jurisdictional issue here. There's a question. While Pilate's jurisdiction supersedes that of Herod, he wants to make sure that he does things the right way, or at least that's what it appears. Maybe he's trying to just really pass the buck. Doesn't matter. In fact, it's interesting, though, what's happening here, because even Pilate is using this to make political maneuvers. In Luke chapter 23, it says up to this point that Herod and Pilate had some animosity, tension. They weren't, quote unquote, getting along. There were some issues there. But it was this trial of Jesus that unites them. Now, he doesn't have to send him to Herod's palace, because Herod is also in the city at the time for Passover and the feast. So he's really probably just sending him around the block, up the street. It's not that far. And so just imagine, you're thinking, how would he get him all the way there and back? It's going to be pretty quick to move him from place to place. But in Luke chapter 23, it's interesting, because we have Pilate saying, I have found him not guilty. In fact, he goes on to say, I've not found him guilty of any of the charges. Remember, Luke has 4 indictments. He says, I haven't found him guilty of misleading the people, and I've not found him guilty of any of the charges. He says, nor has Herod. So then it's just piling on. We have Jesus in 2 different jurisdictions being found not guilty. But it's the very thing he's going to be killed for. Being found, declared not guilty 3 times by Pilate and 1 time by Herod was simply still not enough. The message should be clear at this point, crystal clear. That they would stop at nothing to see Christ dead. Well, what they didn't realize, and what we know, is that was always God's plan. That was always God's plan. There was never a time when that was not God's plan. Now, when we recognize that Jesus is being flogged, I think sometimes we just go right past it to the cross. We don't really stop and think about the severity of it, do we? Now let's imagine for just a moment, before we get to the flogging, that the man taking the beating by the Roman soldiers, they also have heard Pilate say, he's not guilty. They transport him to Herod. Here he's not guilty. And so in our minds, we should immediately begin to think that this is illegal. He's been declared not guilty 3 times. And at Herod 4, they've heard this, but yet they participate in what we would consider an illegal activity. But notice what it says in John chapter 19, verse 1. Then Pilate took Jesus and flogged him. Now some scholars say that Jesus was flogged twice. I disagree. Here's why. They say that in Matthew and Mark, that the flogging appears to be given after the death sentence that Pilate gives. Now, the death sentence has not been given yet in John's gospel. In fact, Barabbas hasn't even been set free yet. Pilate has this plan, this strategy that he wants to both appease the people, that is the high priest, and he at the same time wants to acquit Jesus through the pardon of the people. So there's this flawed strategy that he's trying to work out. He sent him to Herod, hopefully that he can pass the buck, maybe appease Herod. His strategy is breaking down at every point. So some say, well, this is a minor flogging, kind of a warning, kind of what you would give a hooligan, because in the Roman world there were 3 types of flogging. Now, we know Jesus gets the most severe, and I believe here, because I don't believe there were 2, it simply doesn't seem to make sense that Pilate would flog him, bring him back, and then flog him to almost the point of death right before his crucifixion. What we find actually in the synoptics is that they're referring to it in past tense. And so they're not laying it out in chronological precision there. They're referring to the flogging. They include it in kind of as a summary statement, the flogging and the crucifixion. But the way it's used in the tense, I think, coincides with what we have here. So there's one flogging. It's a very severe flogging. So Pilate sends him out to be flogged. Now, what is that? That's a severe beating. Now, I want you to recognize that every time that they hit Jesus, every time that they beat him, they were beating an innocent man. Pilate ordered the beating of an innocent man. Now, in my mind, that's absolutely illegal. That's unjust. But what we don't know about Roman law is that because Jesus wasn't a citizen, that it was legal. Now, had Jesus been a Roman citizen, it would have been illegal. You couldn't flog or beat a Roman citizen. All we have to do is go into the book of Acts and we can see, wait a minute, when they found out Paul was a Roman citizen, they realized real quick, we're going to have some legal problems on our hands. But under Roman law, a non-citizen could be beaten to appease the prosecutor or the accuser to bring about peace. We'll recognize, though, this still universally is wrong. Everything wrong about this. And so I want to remind you of the agony and the pain that Christ is enduring. At every step of the way, we see that he's enduring this unjust system. Injustice from beginning to end. But he's taking that beating, and I think sometimes we don't pause to consider not only the beating, but the senseless nature of it. That everybody involved in the beating knew that this man was absolutely not guilty, that he was innocent, yet they still beat him. What is it that could propel a person to beat another human being to the point of almost death? Now, one might say maybe anger could. Maybe an attempt to defend a family member. Maybe revenge or vengeance could drive you to that point. I'm not saying that any of those are legitimate reasons to beat someone almost to death. But I'm saying we could probably imagine in our mind scenarios where you become so angry that you may be pushed into something like that. I would hope not, and certainly that would be the case. We would all hope that that's not true of any of us. But you can almost imagine, okay, I could kind of see that situation. But how about this? A person who's been declared innocent, not guilty, over and over, and yet you still beat him within an inch of your life. What does that tell you about the people we're dealing with? I think it gives us an indication of the cruelty. Truly, how cruel the Romans were. How hate-filled and vindictive they were. How malicious and mean-spirited. And I want to say this, and how much they hated the Jews. Don't ever forget that. They hated the Jews. Some have speculated that Pilate does all this and to hopefully get pity for Jesus. No. He hates Jesus, he hates the Jews, and he's trying to humiliate everybody involved. Please do not elevate Pilate's status one iota. He was a depraved, damned human being who allowed and led those soldiers to do vicious things to our Lord. He's no innocent man here. He's no innocent bystander. He's actively participating in the beating. I want to remind you of something, though. Jesus told them that if the owner sent the son, what they would do to the son. Remember the parable? That they would kill the son. And that's exactly what they were trying to do. Both Jew, you hear the hatred outside, don't you? Oh, you can hear it as they cry out their hatred. But you can also see it on the inside. Both Jew and Gentile hate Jesus. It's illustrative of us. We may be tempted to think, because of the culture that we grew up in, because of our ethnicity, our nationality, that maybe we love God more. But left to ourselves, we are both, all of us, just like them. We would hate God. We would want to kill God, suppress God, remove God from our lives. But isn't that just like him? To take all of our hatred. We talk about how he took all of our sin on the cross. We celebrate that great truth. We never minimize it. It is second to none. But in that scourging, he took upon himself all of our hatred, all of our maliciousness, anger, vile, vengeance. He bore it willfully. At any moment, he could have stopped it all, but he didn't. See, if you try to run to the cross, you have to trip over the flogging. You have to pause and be reminded of it. Now we come to the Roman soldiers as they put a crown on him, a robe. The robe may have come from Herod because Herod dressed him up a little bit to make fun of him. In fact, put a purple robe on him. The synoptics have said they gave him a scepter, and they took it from him and beat him with it. Here it says they say, "Hail the King." And they hit him with their hands. Now in the English it doesn't really bring it out, but the concept is that they were doing it again and again. It wasn't enough to take out all your hatred and anger and beat him with the flogging, but now you have to humiliate him. Now, there's something that all of us universally don't like. No one likes to be humiliated. Have you ever been humiliated before? Whether intentionally or unintentionally? More than likely you have. We've had that boss, that person in our life. It's one thing to be humiliated privately. I mean, we've had that moment where somebody talks down to you, kind of get that lump in your throat. That moment, it's really uncomfortable, isn't it? You kind of get that fight or flight moment, don't you? Like, I might stand up and show you, don't humiliate somebody like me, or I'm just going to run and never be around this person again. We understand that emotion. It's a very difficult time. But I tell you what's worse than being humiliated in front of, just by yourself with one other person, is being humiliated in front of people. You ever been humiliated in front of people that you respect, you care about? People you want to respect you. Well, that's hard, isn't it? It really is. I mean, you just get this feeling in your stomach, and you kind of, in that moment, you're paralyzed. You don't want to lash out. There's people around you that you respect and respect you. But you also recognize that what's being said is probably not true. If you've not been in that moment, you've maybe been party to it, seeing it happen to somebody else. It's just uncomfortable all the way around. You kind of feel a sense of pity for the person it's happening to, or you feel self-pity for yourself. Jesus sat there and was completely humiliated. I've come to believe that people who attempt to humiliate others do so because they're insecure and do it as a way to boost up their own self. So what we're finding here is the depths of human sin. Who was it that they were beating? Who was it that they were punching in the face? Who was it that they were mocking, saying, "Hail the King of the Jews"? It's interesting when we think about what they're doing. Is revealing the majesty of Christ. I think we get in this moment as followers of Christ and we become defensive, don't we? Because we know what it feels like to be humiliated, to really, if you will, be metaphorically slapped or spit on. We don't like that. We don't like it. And certainly we don't believe that anyone should degrade our Lord. But in their crude acknowledgement, unbeknownst to them, they're declaring His majesty. That's the beauty of this. We can get in the moment where, like, I'm going to be Peter. I would never have let that happen to Jesus. There's no way someone would have slapped him or spit on him if I was standing there. But what you don't realize is you were the one slapping and spitting on him. It's illustrative of your sin and my sin. But behind it is the majesty of the King of Kings. Unbeknownst to them, His majesty was on full display. We think about a king who's displayed in all of his majesty. We see He comes out in man-made garments. We see He sits on a man-made throne and receives man-centered praises. But what Christ is demonstrating, it is His majesty didn't depend upon human recognition. That He would be fully majestic and glorious if every single human being who ever lived rejected Him. That He would still be majestic if every single one of us slapped Him and mocked Him. Now we can begin to see this tension in the text of both the hidden and the revealed majesty of Christ. It's there simultaneously, isn't it? On the one hand, they don't know who they're hitting. They can't see it. It's veiled to their eyes. Because if it was known to them, they would have kneeled. And they would have said, "Hail the King of the Jews." They would have said, "Hail the King of Kings." But it was veiled to them. Again, in another, what we would call John's ironies, a Johannine irony, they're doing the very thing that someday they would do. That is, there's coming a day when every knee will bow and every tongue will confess. And that majesty will not be veiled at all. I know it is hard for us to see His majesty in that moment. What we are tempted to see is a travesty. In the midst of all of the injustice, we see the beauty of the Christ. As we move forward in the text, we come to that place where Pilate brings him out. We can't even imagine what he must have looked like at this point. How mangled his face must have been. Probably barely able to stand after the scourging. With this robe on, the purple robe probably covered in blood. A crown. Many have imagined the crown is pressing in on his skull is probably made of like a date tree, and they would have been like 12-inch long thorns, and so that wasn't the point to push it in his head. It was the point to where they would have constructed. It would have had like these high 12-inch points around, and so it would have looked foolish. So here he is with this crown that looks ridiculous, a robe that just absolutely looks hideous. I mean, in every way, I want you to understand when Pilate presents them, he is not trying to present the pitiful Jesus. He wants to show them the wretched, ludicrous, and worthless man that stands before them. There's no way this man could be a king. No king would ever look like this. No king would ever be arrayed like this. No king would ever be so weak. He has no one following him. No one would come to save him or rescue him. He stands here alone. Look how worthless this man is. Look how pathetic he is. He's not trying to elicit pity. He wants to humiliate all of them. Here's your king. Behold the man. Not behold the king. But behold the man. Pilate wants them to recognize that not only is he not a threat to them, that is to Rome, but they aren't a threat either. This is what we can do to any one of you at any time. But of course, Jesus will let him know the only reason he has any authority is because it's been given to him. And woe is the man who was given the authority to kill the Christ. This worthless, harmless, pathetic man. Can I remind you that we are in the Gospel of John? And it was John who said, "The Word became flesh." Is it possible? Is it possible that this moment is the consequence of the Word becoming flesh? The Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory. We've been trained not to think of Christ standing there, arrayed in glory. But ladies and gentlemen, that was the consequence of the incarnation. When God became man, humanity hated him and killed him. There's the consequence of the greatest doctrine. It's hard to get our mind around it, isn't it? We would have never done that to Jesus. We did that to Jesus, collectively. But it wasn't enough. It just wasn't. I don't know, if you're like me, I always root for the underdog. I know some of you fair weather fans, you always root for, some of you always root for the big brother, the better team. Fine. I love an underdog story. I really do. I love to root for the underdog. I don't know. That's just me. Maybe it's because inherently I have this disposition to feel sorry. I don't want to say feel sorry, but feel a connection, maybe feel empathy, sympathy for somebody. You ever seen somebody hurting and you're broken for them? I don't know, we say you feel sorry for them. I don't mean it that way. You know what I'm saying when I say that. We feel sorry, that is, we're broken. We feel this sense of connection, and we don't want to see them in that condition. We want to help. I don't know, maybe it's because I'm an A-type. I'm a fixer. So if I see you messed up, I'm like, let me fix you. We can fix this, I promise. But you see people, and you see them in a rather pathetic state, and you feel like you want to help. There was just something I could do. On that day, I'd like to think maybe there was somebody who saw Jesus in that condition and thought, oh my gosh, I feel some sympathy or empathy for him. The Bible doesn't record any. Certainly we have Nicodemus and we have Joseph of Arimathea. We'll be introduced to them shortly, and I'd imagine that they did. When you see that man like that, humiliated, beaten, covered in blood, just standing there, just a frail reminder of what he once was, and that's not enough for you? I think you need to recognize that when they cry out, notice that John has them crying out, not just saying it. The high priests are no longer just encouraging the crowd. They are crying out, crucify him. Crucify him. It's not enough for them that he's standing there in all that shame and humiliation and beaten, ridiculed and mocked. It's just not enough. I need you to see how deep sin is, how deeply rooted it is, and then I need you to recognize who's saying it. This was supposed to be, if this is Annas and Caiaphas, because he's referring to them in the plural, if they're standing there together, these are supposed to be the most righteous, religious people on the face of the earth. They speak to God on behalf of the people. That is, the words that they speak, the mouth that is uttering the words, crucify him, are the same mouths that are uttering to God, have mercy on us. Same mouth. The two men who have interceded for the people, again, intercede for the people. Their role is exactly the same. Their role has not changed at all, has it? They're still speaking to God on behalf of the people. We want you to die. I think you need to pause for a moment and recognize that truly reveals our condition. That the ones who had been appointed to intercede do so faithfully. Oh, we're ready to get on. I wouldn't have done that. I wouldn't have said that. They were saying something on your behalf and on my behalf. They truly were interceding for us. Kill him. Kill him. Kill him. daunting. It wasn't enough. Pilate is frustrated, rightfully so. I mean, he's the clown leading the circus. He's upset. They're not moving in the order that he wants them to. The show's become a spectacle. He says, well, then you take him and crucify him, knowing that they don't have the right legally to carry out a crucifixion. They can't carry out the death sentence, so he's mocking them. He says, I brought him out that you may know that I find no guilt in him. And they say, kill him anyway. He says, you take him and kill him. In a sense, what we have here is Pilate, if you will, we could paraphrase what's happening in this interchange. You bring him to me for judgment, but yet you don't receive my judgment. Pilate's not advocating for Jesus. He's advocating for himself. What we know of Pilate was that he was a vicious man. Several years before, his mentor, leader, had been found guilty of trying to lead a coup against the emperor. Pilate was under suspicion of being part of it. He couldn't risk any bad political maneuvers. He had to keep peace, and he had to be politically astute to do so. He doesn't want an uprising in either way. He wants the best of both worlds. But finally, we get the new charge. This is where we will wrap up today and we'll lead into next week. He gets the new charge. Finally, the truth comes out, doesn't it? They're now going to say what's really the problem. Now, keep in mind, again, he has been declared not guilty 4 times. 1 with Herod, 3 with Pilate. He's been beaten to appease the high priest and the people. The hero of the people, Barabbas, has not been set free yet. Pilate's strategy has failed. And now they say there's a new charge. It's all going to come into focus now. This has been really their charge all along, has it not been? He has made himself to be the Son of God. And I want to tell you something in this statement. I want to point to you. I want to show you the nexus, the center of the hatred of Jesus Christ from then until now. His exclusive claim is why people hate him. Not just the claim, but because he was exactly who he claimed to be. Notice the wording here. He has made himself to be the Son of God. In other words, he's an imposter. He's not the real thing. It's interesting that these statements, this trial, was the actual path upon which Christ would travel to demonstrate and vindicate and ultimately, finally validate to the world that he was the Son of God. But this is the very reason they hated him then, and it's the reason they hate him now. If Jesus was just a prophet, just a good teacher, they're okay with that. He's just one of many. It's not a problem. Listen, he was just a moral man trying to tell us how to be good people. Listen, good people love to hear somebody telling them to be good people. It's because they think they are. Isn't that most of what preaching in church is? It's just a bunch of good people being told how to be good? That's what we think. I can get that at the mosque. I can get that at the temple. What I can't get there is the proclamation that Jesus Christ was the Son of God. He didn't make himself the Son of God. He just told Pilate when he says, are you a king? He said, this is the very reason I've come into the world. This is the very reason I was born. He was born a king. He was born the Son of God because there was never a time when he wasn't. He didn't make himself anything. I want you to think about that word made. And I want to remind you of where we are. And I just want to draw your attention just quickly back to John chapter 1. He didn't make himself to be the Son of God. He was in the making business, though. Verse 2 of chapter 1. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him. This is the one thing he didn't make. That is, he didn't make himself, and he didn't make himself the Son of God, because he always was. the same time, we see simultaneously here the beauty, the splendor, the majesty, the glory of the Son of God on display. But the backdrop for it is the rebellious sinfulness and wretchedness of humanity. How is it that we know of this beautiful grace? Because it was displayed in a broken and sinful world. The next time that you read John 3:16, which is in the same book here, when you hear it, for God so loved the world, I want you to be reminded of that word, that it's reminding of us of the badness of the world. The emphasis there in the text isn't the bigness, but the badness. He came into that world to show God's love and to save us. So I thank God that Jesus was humiliated. I thank God that Jesus was beaten. I thank God that Jesus was crucified. Because in all of that, I see the beauty of God's grace that comes to sinners like us. That grace wasn't cheap. Let's pray. Father, thank you that I've had the privilege and the honor to stand before your people